This guy's name is Urban Maoism. I've known him for a little bit on Twitter. He's part of the Cave Twitter. That's where Kaki came from. If you guys don't know who Kaki is, shout out. He's one of the original guests of this show, and yeah, I think he also knows Ed Berg and those types of people. But this guy's really based. He's really cool. All right, I'm bringing him now. Hey, what's up, man? Hello.
Hey man, what's up?
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, it's all good.
For sure, man. How you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, sorry, I think yeah, I was just sort of, because the delay on the stream. Yeah, we should get the show about, I want to sort of talk about the Anglo-Saxon stuff and the Normans and the conquest and Doomsday at a later date. We need to get that shit ironed out. And
Yeah,
plan for
yeah,
that.
we got it. Yeah, it's been everything pretty much is my fault when it comes to scheduling anything, just
Hey man,
because.
don't worry about that,
Yeah.
man. I've been like, that's the thing. Like I've been seeing the way you've been sort of going along this like this tendency, sorry, this trajectory, and I feel like I didn't want to sort of intrude on it. Like I like what you've been doing, and I like this sort of like the way things have been going. But like this is why I wanted to come on tonight because like
Hmm.
I saw you sort of I tuned in whilst you were sort of like like having a kind of like seeing like becoming kind of like pessimistic or seeming it seemed like a little bit pessimistic, and I feel like we got to hold the line a little bit, like we got to make sure we don't fall into any kind of pessimism, we got to stay optimistic.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean the topic that we're gonna talk about is gonna be super in depth, and I
Yeah.
myself wanted to like prepare some things to talk about it too because it's gonna be about the origin of the Anglo meme, but the meme is on the
Hmm.
surface misleading because
Hmm.
well, I don't want to spoil it, but we'll
Yeah. Just to sort of entice the fucking the chat a little bit, I just want to say like you know the people who call themselves Anglo-Saxons today, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they're sort of like the WASPs. These people are not Anglo-Saxon, okay? What you understand, as Americans and even as English people who might be watching and people across the world, what people understand as Anglo-Saxons, what has been taught to you as what Anglo-Saxon means, is not at all what Anglo-Saxon means. It is something which is a complete fabrication, a complete sort of a vulgar romantic version of Anglo-Saxon society, which is grounded in a post-Norman conquest ideal. But yeah, I don't want to spoil too much.
yeah, yeah, and I think it'll really help allow us to clarify like what we're talking about when we talk about the whole Anglo thing, on show. So,
Yeah.
um, but anyway, I think there was a few things you wanted to.
Yeah, I just all I wanted to sort of talk about is that like I think that people I saw like whilst you were talking and you were sort of really like sort of bearing your heart out to people in the stream, and I saw a lot of people in the chat sort of just like kind of repeat like slogans and kind of just sort of like chat like it normally is, but I feel like you were really trying to get at something there, like people are kind of I feel like a lot of people are kind of missing the point of what you were trying to say there, and I think like it's really important that we realize that like we do need to hold a line, and we do need to show ourselves as kind of have a strong face and have a strong sort of presentation towards the world and towards the sort of internet left and all the rest of it. But at the same time, we need to like sort of have the moment to sort of take a step back and analyze ourselves, right? And I think it's really like, you and like sort of the collective, the infrared collective in general, like you're very good at like sort of trying to kind of communicate new ideas and very interesting ideas through a lens which is pre-established and through a continuity which is pre-established. And I think it's very important, and it's good work. Sorry, pardon me. It's very good work that you're doing. I think it's very important work actually. But I think that people in the community need to sort of like I don't know, sort of like engage with the kind of less in the kind of sloganeering, less in the kind of like I like the whole gorillas and sons and all the rest of it. It's good shit, it's fun shit, it's very good. It's good to get the energy up. But I feel like sometimes like we need to slow down a bit, cool down a bit, read, engage, discuss, study. I don't know. I feel like a lot of it, like we can fall too easily into this kind of like advertising and sloganeering and propaganda without the substance or that I think really backs it up. And that's what's interesting about infrared as a phenomenon. Really, is something which is gets across new ideas and new meaning, and gives like meaning to something which is been there for a long time, but is not really reached into the surface. You know what I mean? So this is the thing. It's 3 a.m. right now, and I'm a little bit drunk, so bear with me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, we definitely gotta return to kind of maybe not exactly the way it was in the past of infrared, but we definitely do have to start dropping more pills, so to speak. And you
Yes.
know, I've just I've kind of talked about why I've been hesitant to do that, but I realize now that I gotta get with the program. I just can't let the haters define me
Yeah.
entirely. They're inevitably gonna
Yeah.
define a little bit about me, but I can't let them have everything.
Yeah. That's the thing, man. I mean, you're totally right in saying, your enemies always define you. And that's the thing, like, like your enemies will define you until you win. Like
Hmm.
until you win, your enemies will always define you. And that's the thing. You got to always push on to win. And that's the thing. That's the victory is, it seems very like, hard to see. It seems very sort of like clouded, right? But it will happen. It will happen. I do think so. It's like personally, like I'm sort of interested. Like I don't know, I find myself in a kind of crisis of politics right now, and in general, just sort of all the time, just because it seems very cloudy and impossible to really delineate these things in like real meanings, right? In terms of like left, right, Marxist, socialist, communist. It seems very hard to sort of pin these things down and ground these things in reality when reality seems to sort of slip away from you all the time. Like all these things seem to slip away constantly, and all these words and all these phrases and all these symbols and images seem to sort of like always like collapse in on themselves and become sort of parodies of themselves. But I think it's like I used to be for quite a long time a member of a Marxist-Leninist political organization, and I found like just the kind of the lack of creativity and the lack of an ability to engage properly with the dynamics of sort of with this like approaching postmodern life, approaching postmodern condition. Like even these phrases are very hard to say. If we are living in a sort of postmodern world or whatever, it's like
Hmm.
I just feel like a lot of Marxist-Leninists in the West have been unable to sort of face the future, right? Like face the world that we're living in, face the world we're coming into. And I think what sort of made me sort of, really engage and really enjoy your show is the fact that you were sort of, not it's not just a sort of question of updating something that already exists, right? But actually introducing new meaning and new
Hmm.
ideas and imbuing these things into like a real something which is, as you say, worthy of the postmodern world, right? Like worthy of the contemporary world.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't know this as well, but a lot of us started out in the same way. At first, we were naive Western MLs of some kind, and then we went through that kind of phase of seeing that it was just too dogmatic and too rigid and too inadequate. But now it's kind of full circle because I think we've come to appreciate that the way that the meaning of Marxism-Leninism has been dictated in the West, uh, the meaning of that phrase Marxism-Leninism for the countries in which it has actual history and authority, is completely different. It means something
Mm.
completely different there. And the
Yes.
Westerners
Yes.
have not done a good job of actually translating what it means into the West. And that's why when we
Yeah.
think of Marxism Leninism as Westerners, we do think of those kinds of really rigid, dogmatic, people who, very interestingly, they posture about being simple and concrete, and all the things, all the ideas you and I acquaint ourselves with and explore are just nonsense and meaningless, bourgeois eclecticism or
Mm.
something. But in order to posture about having a simplistic and crude, you know position, you have to show for it in reality. And Western Marxist-Leninists do not have much to show of at all in terms of what the real.
Right, completely. I mean, like, the Western Marxist-Leninism to me seems like it's sort of like, I don't know, like sort of some of the things I've been thinking of recently. It feels like it's kind of like, like I know you chat shit about like Kazhev in the past, right? But like the way Kazhev writes about Hegel, right? It seems like he's kind of like turning Hegel into this like atheistic, like this like inversion of the kingdom of God, right? Sort of like
Mm-hmm.
creating this like fucking like eschaton, this like perfect state, right? And I feel like a lot of Marxists kind of like read like in Marx, or a lot of them don't read Marx or whatever, but like read around Marxism towards this idea of like the sort of idealized kingdom of God on earth, right? This kind of like eschatological communism. And it just feels like it's, one of the things I'm really refreshed by in terms of your content, right? Is you're the first person I've seen in like proper Marxist-Leninists, who goes by the tradition, who goes by the actual tradition, who says that like no, communism is the real movement, and actually means it,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of people sort of use these phrases and use these terms, but it actually doesn't have real meaning behind it because the theoretical like backing does not actually support that, like yeah, and communism, communism is not the eschaton, right? Like communism is not heaven, communism is basically like it's part of the process of history, but it's not this like eschatological fucking endpoint, right? It's like it's something far greater than that, As much as that sounds strange to say that there can be something greater than that.
And the problem, though, is that, a lot of Westerners, especially breadtube, when they're using these phrases like communism or socialism, they're pretending to use them with authority as though someone has sanctified their specific meaning of those words. But when I ask them to show me anywhere in Marx where, their dogmatism can be justified, they always come up short.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately coming back to this thing where if we introduce this kind of Darwinian environment of no assumptions and the best meaning will have to prevail. To clarify that, what I mean is that if we strip the pretense to authority these type of breadtube and even established MLs in the West have over words like socialism and communism, and introduce this environment where people will actually have to explore the meaning of these words and actually have to persuade people as to which meaning makes the most sense based on what we know about history, these people won't survive. They just won't. You know, it's ultimately the fact that the meaning of socialism and communism is no authority exists which just makes that meaning self-evident, and especially there's no authority that sanctifies one specific definition as eternal and true. There just isn't an authority. I think people are struggling to understand that there's no knowledge authority when it comes to these words. You actually have to do the work of trying to make sense of them.
Right. I mean, something that I think there's, something that I think, something I gleaned from being a sort of, I suppose, an activist in a Marx-Leninist group for a long time was the fact that, like, I started to understand as time went on that, like, right, so we need to sort of think about what a capitalist is, right? A capitalist is somebody who is actively sort of in command of production, right? So necessarily, right, to be a communist, somebody who's trying to sort of move towards move towards the sublation of capitalism, right? You sort of like you have to be active, right? You have to be actively engaged in that struggle. You have to be actively pushing for that struggle, whatever that might mean and however that might materialize, right? But it's about like the active movement, right? The real movement, right? It's something that I think this is like the powerful, like what I think is interesting and powerful about sort of your phrasing of like Marxism-Leninism in the age of multipolarity, right? It's a recognition that we are no longer with the hyper connectivity of the world and with the sort of the massive rapid transformation of communication technology and also just exchange and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have sort of now come face to face with the fact that like our world can no longer really be defined just by the sort of local place that we used to that we used to define the world by, and like our kind of like the what we engage in is becoming more and more of a choice, right? In terms of like, we have more and more sort of freedom in regards to how we engage with the world in such a strange way, right? Like, and I think, the how China sort of like, and places like China and Russia, etc., how they sort of present themselves to the world. So I'm probably rambling right now. I am a
No,
little
no, you're
bit drunk,
not.
so
Please
I do
continue.
apologize for that bit.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
Yeah, but
Continue.
yeah, I think like it's like the way sort of China and Russia have had their incredibly long and incredibly rich histories of political movement and economic movement, right? Like we no longer have the sort of luxury of being separate from them, right? Because of how hyper-connected the world is and how integral actually China is, specifically China to the world economy and to the Western markets, and also Russia now to the political sort of the political scene, especially in the American context, and in the British context, it's less so. But again, we had the what do you call it? The Skripal case, right, in England. We had all of that bullshit go on, right? Like Russia is integral to our experience in Britain as well, in the same way that China is to England and America and the rest of the world, and also how Russia is to America in terms of the Russian bots problem, right? Like we no longer sort of have the kind of like how hyper-connected we are. It's something that like has been developing and brewing for a long time, but it's specifically heightened during the Cold War, and something which we sort of were like allowed to forget or allowed to sort of remystify, I suppose, against like to sort of like border ourselves from, I suppose, like from during the kind of like 1990s, the kind of victory of the West over the rest of the world, supposedly, like we were sort of able to sort of push up these barriers again whilst constantly expanding, constantly interconnecting, constantly globalizing, and sort of bridging all these gaps and borders together, like and breaking down these barriers. And now I think the people who were profiting so much from that sort of disintegration of barrier are now trying so hard to create artificial barriers in strange places and strange ways to reassert their authority. And I really, I think they're kind of they're fumbling, they're fumbling at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect way to put it, and I really think it's interesting the angle you're coming from is the angle of hyperconnectivity, whereas a lot of people assume multipolarity maybe means more disconnect, but you have to think dialectically. It also actually entails more hyperconnectivity. So I really like you put it that way. Another thing I kind of remembered you said was about that if we're communists, it means we're somehow actively relating to the real movement, communism. And, a lot of people say, how could you be a communist with a capital C when you're not part of a formal communist party? Because that's the meaning of being a communist. And also, being a party within the orthodox Marxist-Leninist perspective is the primary means by which an individual can establish an active relation to the real movement. But the way I put it basically is that this is going to be like such the biggest bullshit cop-out, but I genuinely believe it is. You have to think about how Land thinks AI has relevance for time, basically that there's something in the future reassembling the past in real time. The same thing is true for what it means to be a communist today, I think. I think that's
Totally.
that's the significance for me of CPUSA 2036. And 2036 is an arbitrary year. It just denotes.
Of course, it's a big number. It's a big number, which means future, right?
Exactly,
Like,
precisely. I just
Yeah.
thought that the number for some reason just worked the best for
Oh no, it
denoting
sounds
the future.
fantastic, man. I mean, it's like and of course you can see this in real time, like how this number has meaning because you see people, they hear the CPUSA 2036. It's like, yeah, fuck it, hell, CPUSA 2036. Like they, people agree with it. I agree with it. I'm not even American. I agree with it. Like I think it's sick. Like it's fucking sick.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. People need to really go back and fucking watch the first episode of Infrared, right? Like that's like the thing I'll say to the chat is go and watch the first episode with Infrared with Cocky Duty. Like watch that thing. Some of the fucking stuff you discuss in that is fantastic. It's fantastic. Like it's really great conversation. And I think, this is the thing you were talking about earlier with the kind of the way Infrared has changed. I think, you need to, I think both of them have absolutely equal value, right? Absolutely equal merit. I think you may perhaps, to give perhaps, the smallest bit of criticism, perhaps you can sort of synthesize it in a better way or whatever, I don't know, like it's up for you to work on that in
No,
your own
I agree
way,
with
in
that
your own perspective.
100%. It's yeah, I need to focus on actually in at least accelerating the dialectic between them, and putting that dialectic to work, because
Yeah.
I think at this point I've kind of deviated too far from it. But cocky to me represents a corner of the internet that I think um, needs to be given popular representation.
Hmm.
And we need to be up to this Promethean task of distilling, but not erasing or forgetting, because there's obviously things that the layman is not going to be able to understand from, the whole cave Twitter crowd or whatever. But there's so many brilliant people in that crowd, and I don't want to. I know everyone hates being flattered, but I would consider you among them. There's so many brilliant people from that crowd who people just don't know about, and they should know about. And I think there's something, maybe if there's anything insane about what we're doing at Infrared, I think it's basically this idea that we can actually confront BreadTube with this. And if you know about Cave Twitter, you know how like fringe and just, I mean, comparatively fringe and, I mean, it's called Cave Twitter,
Yeah.
as a broad brush
Also,
for
it's
that.
also dead, right? I mean, this is the
Yeah,
best thing about Cave Tour. It's completely dead, and it's like, but it still exists.
it's dead, but like there's still people who are active who are associated with the whole thing.
Yeah. No, these circles still exist, and these like sort of like these little groups and these little groupings and these like connections still exist. They get lost over time, and the actual name has been like lost to time. But yeah, I think it's kind of funny to think about this. Like, yeah, this. I was I said this the other day on Twitter. Like there's a confrontation. It is kind of like a confrontation between like BreadTube and Cave Twitter. Like Cave Twitter is kind of. I just find it fascinating that the people who have broken out into from the Cave Twitter thing. Of course, you've got people like Matt Calcahoon, Xenogothic and all that, who has sort of made a name for himself as the kind of the Fisher scholar, right? Like and other people like that. But yeah, I think people, like fucking Edberg and his his work with Cantbot, and I mean, my God, like Cantbot's like sort of transformation from like probably the best frog Twitter guy to being like the best sort of post cave Twitter guy or whatever. It's like it's fantastic. Like it's amazing to see these things happen, but like to see Edberg sort of like and yourself as well, and with Infrared, like to see these kind of like what coming out of cave Twitter, funnily enough, is the kind of like tanky side of it, right? Is the kind of neo-tanky side of it. The people who kind of the Marxist-Leninists and the sort of like futurists side of cave Twitter that is like optimistic. The optimistic side of cave Twitter is the one that's coming out, not the kind of pessimistic, like Landian, like Xeno fucking feminist bullshit, like the kind of, I want to just live in a hole and be degenerate kind of like shit, like the people who actually like, no, I want to affirm humanity and I want to be alive, I want to be a human being, like, and I want to be a communist first and foremost. I think that it's fantastic that is what's breaking through.
Back in the glory days of like 2017 and 2018, when I think that was the peak, right? Or maybe I was too late.
Totally.
Yeah.
One thing I was also late. I was also late to the game.
Oh, okay. Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's good. But one of the things I noticed was that one thing that confused me, because I had views that preceded my encounter with Cave Twitter. I think, I had been a Zizekian, vaguely a Zizekian, but a different type of Zizekian than most. But one thing that kind of confused me was that there was an association between optimism, so to speak, or maybe the revolutionary quote-unquote position, and a type of naive, super naive tech bro optimism of Silicon Valley, which was associated with the left accelerationists. And
Right.
At first I was confused, but when I actually read and engaged with the left accelerationists, I realized why they had such a bad rap, because they kind of were that that naive. But to me, the kind of big capital C communist optimism from the 20th century and Stalinism and Maoism and so on bore nothing in common with the naive Silicon Valley kind. It was an optimism that acknowledged but at the same time persevered through what we would consider the darkest and most pessimistic, nihilistic moments of despair that humanity faces. I mean, they weren't naive. They were, I guess, in a sense, optimistic, but they were by no means naively so. But one of the things I mean, we all, it's a dead trend. But one of the things I appreciated about the Landian pessimism, maybe even the one that was unique to Nick Land himself, was that at the very least it acknowledged the bottom of the pit, like the lowest moment of despair that a human being can face as given expression ideologically and politically and theoretically. I appreciate it because once you put that into reality, I can finally look at that and say, we can overcome that. We can persevere through that.
Totally. I think the greatest, like, Nick Land is a gift to Marxists on like multiple levels, right? Like gifts to anyone who wants to critique capital on many, many, many different levels. He's a fantastic writer on many levels, but one of the most important levels of that, I think, is the fact it's something for Marxists, and I also think Christians and religious people in general, Muslims, Christians, etc., to sort of like to resist against in a certain way, to actually overcome in a way which is actually like authentic, to take what is there and to basically turn it against him, Like Land wants to sort of override humanity completely, right? I mean, his whole like meme is that he sides with the productive forces against the people, right?
Yeah.
Like I think it's like, and and on a certain level, it's like I think I do have my sort of my moments and my sort of points where I'm like, I have a sort of a massive like kind of reactionary impulse. All the people who hate me on Twitter, listen to this. This will give you a lot of ammunition. But I have my sort of reactionary impulses where I think like, yeah, fuck it, man. I just love human beings. I hate technology. Blah blah blah. But that is another form of nihilism. At the end of the day, it's a complete form of nihilism. This is the thing. What's been great. Like sort of watching your show is it's made me like you guys have already sort of kicked me up the arse. It's like, okay, I have time to actually fucking read Heidegger, properly, like actually read Heidegger, and it's like, oh my god, what a revelation, what a fucking revelation. Like it's truly broadened my perspective immensely in terms of how a human being relates to themselves and to the world, And yeah, but that's just aside anyway.
I think Land. I consider him one of the most brilliant thinkers in the canon of Marxism. And I've always viewed Land as a challenge. And those Marxists in the West, I mean, I don't think Chinese intellectuals have to care about Land, so to speak. But those Marxists in the West who cannot face Land's challenge, I consider them the epitome of hypocrisy and weakness and sterility. I mean, I would much rather have a guy like Nick Land who gives expression openly and honestly, theoretically, to all of the most pessimistic despair that dwells within our heart than a lot of, so-called Marxists and socialists and obviously breadtube types who do give expression to this ugliness and wickedness and bitterness and nihilism, but very indirectly and passively and unconsciously. It's like almost like, in a way, you just have to watch someone like Vosh to get the same feeling of despair than when you read Land. But the difference is that Land is open and honest about it, and he actually makes sense of it in some way theoretically and owns up to the challenge it poses to us as human beings. Whereas, even though Land surrenders to the challenge and embraces it, but I also really agree with you when you said, the position against technology is the other side of the same coin. It's just as it's also nihilistic, but
Totally nihilistic. Totally.
but at the same time, it's also extremely reductionistic to kind of. I hate the kind of people who think like lawyers and just try to dig dirt on others and be like, oh, well, you were flirting with this and joking around with it, and that means you wholly identify with it. And it's just, obviously, we all have reactionary tendencies and we all entertain different, we all have a spectrum, but not maybe not,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. I'm not ableist. Sorry, guys, don't cancel me.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I mean, it's the thing that is really refreshing about people on the sort of cave Twitter end of things compared with other kinds of like, sort of, I don't know, like sort of like pseudo scenes that exist on the internet, right? And political and philosophical scenes or whatever the fuck. Like, it's, cringe to talk about this shit or whatever. But like, the thing that is interesting about cave Twitter and I was actually engaging about it is people are more open to discuss like issues, let's say, like, what is the actual importance of like, the Eurasian movement, right? Like, what is the actual importance of like, people from as disparate as like, how can leftists interact with Nick Land? How can or like how can people of a sort of socialist or communistic sort of like tendency interact with Land and interact with Dugin, interact with these strange sort of postmodern figures who represent something which, to the sort of like more boring, Marxist, more boring leftist is just this kind of like terrifying, like, oh no, it's not modernist, it's not like within my very strict frame, it's not within this like very cozy 20th century model that I've constructed around myself, or this like to broaden it to this like very cozy post-French revolutionary model, right? Like these people who sort of seem to repudiate everything that I've thought about and everything I think and all of my modern history or whatever. Like the thing that's good about cave Twitter and the thing that's good about these kinds of tendencies and these kinds of like scenes is that they are actually open. I had a great discussion the other day with some people about why I think that like the Russian radical scene, right, radical politics is like an indication of the breakdown of modernism, right? And like in Russia you have like on the one hand obviously the National Bolsheviks that everyone fucking harps on about, but you have other movements, you have RNU, you have all these different movements, and Mars, all these fucking little strange tendencies, strange groupings and things, which in their like in their language, in their symbolism, sort of combine the entirety of their own nation's history in itself, right? Like you have combinations of like the sort of like the imperial eagle with the hammer and sickle, with like Tsar Nicholas and Stalin, and you have all these sort of combinations and convergences. And I think it's really like an attempt, I think, to sort of like, this is not something that's fully formed yet. I'm still trying to sort of work this out and like write some stuff on it. But like, so, watch this space or whatever. But like, it's like, I think it's sort of really trying to like create a new language, right? I think it's like people are trying to sort of, through like sort of assembling and kind of like experimenting and alchemically experimenting with like all this like old language and these old forms, these 20th century forms, really trying to break through. I mean, like something that Caleb talks about all the time, and to for good reason, is the fact that like in China now, Mao and Confucius are taught side by side, and that's such a significant thing. That's such a significant thing that people just don't discuss, and the thing that, again, I like Caleb for this because he discusses it and he realizes how important this is, like the civilizational importance of this. Like it's something which draws together a sort of a consistent thread throughout all of history, right? As a way to kind of break through into the new world that is coming, the new reality which is coming, which is going to, which is materializing more and more as like we sort of flow towards like disintegration more and more and more and more. There are forces in the world which are actively trying to be ready for it and to sort of present themselves to it and use everything that has been learned, not falling into dogmatism and not falling into sort of weird little like axioms and weird little codings and things like this as a way to kind of like defend themselves in themselves against it, right? But trying to, as I think you have the right language for this to be worthy of it, right? Like, I think it's something that you see in Russia specifically, and in China specifically, right? Like in the West, we've kind of been sort of caught up in rejecting, right? As a sort of like coping mechanism, a defense mechanism. And I think it's really dangerous for Westerners to kind of act like this, because it means that like, like, as much as, we like to sort of talk on, harp on about like how great China is, like, there are great things in I don't, believe in Western civilization as a universal, like, total thing, right? And of course, there's many different Western civilizations, right? Like England is a civilization, right? Like, France, etc., Germany. There are many different forces, civilizational forces, that exist, right? And they deserve, and they need to sort of confront the new world, the coming world, in an authentic way. And I think, Russia is just ahead of the curve on this, right? I feel like, when Lenin talks about like the sort of the weak link in the imperialist chain, right? I think there's a kind of similar dynamic going on, right? Where Russia is kind of like the weak link in the postmodern chain, I suppose. I mean, that's like a massive feud right now,
No,
But like, I think
see
it
what
kind
you're
of
saying.
is,
Yeah, a few things. You said a lot of really interesting things. The last thing you said, I think, I always try to emphasize this. To me, learning from China isn't about copying Chinese culture, but it's actually about learning about how we can reconcile the popular and national realities of our own specific countries and their histories and their traditions, how we can rediscover those things after modernity. And that does apply to the West as well, especially Europe, and obviously also the UK. As much as we have the anti-Anglo meme, the UK is full of real national realities, among which include the English reality of the English people.
Yeah.
And there is here a civilization, real history and civilization. It's just that after this period of modernity, that civilization has been exclusively defined in the outward form by colonialism and imperialism
Yes.
and so on. But there are latent forces, latent national realities that have long been forgotten, even within the West, that I think only the Chinese model provides an example of right now, to exhume, sorry if I'm saying that correctly, to unearth, and rediscover. And America is a little bit more complicated though, because America is not really a nation at all. But that's, I guess, a separate conversation. But another thing you mentioned was about Russia, and literally my own thoughts personally, and also in our collective. It's literally like we've arrived at the same thing, completely independent from each other. Because actually, also that way of describing Russia, of all of these seemingly amorphous and chaotic, as you put it, alchemical combinations between different forms, as a way in which this deeper striving to break out of classical modernity is being given. It's exactly how we're looking at it as well. And actually, Russia specifically has a unique way of giving expression to that very contradiction between forms, which I've located in theological terms of the specificities of Russian Orthodox Christianity. To me, just to elaborate a little bit more about this, to me, the same contradiction you're describing, whether it's the National Bolsheviks and all the other types of crazy, contradictory syncreticisms and stuff, this fundamental dwelling within paradox and contradiction, I think you can even find this in the novels of a guy like Nabokov. What's his name? Nabokov, the guy who wrote Lolita. But he also
the
wrote.
guy, yeah.
He also wrote another novel, Pale Fire. Pale Fire, and it's about the same thing. It's about this dwelling in contradiction, which was the emblem of the Russian Empire, the double-headed eagle. And what is that if not the contradiction, East and West, right? And then it's not a coincidence
that's
that
fascinating.
The Soviet Union, the hammer and the sickle, the peasants who represented the Eastern Russian national kind of tradition, and then the hammer, which represented the kind of Western modernity. So Russia, I think, has always related to the fundamental contradiction. And in Hegelian terms, the contradiction is the absolute object. It's a contradiction. Each civilization just relates to it differently, but the way Russia specifically relates to it is through this type of dwelling and freezing, specifically freezing the contradiction in time, and then dwelling in not the form of the contradiction, but the contradiction in the form. If that makes, I myself sound ridiculous when I was saying this, but how I put it better,
Of course,
I guess.
we have to sound ridiculous when we talk about these things, because it's a ridiculous subject matter, right? I mean, like postmodernity is ridiculous. Like,
Yeah, of course, of course.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying about orthodoxy, though, right? I mean, because like the Russian Orthodox Church, like it grounds itself on this kind of like adoration of the Church Fathers, right? It grounds itself on this idea that it is like the true church, which finds its lineage right back to the foundation of Jesus Christ, right? And it goes right back to the Church Fathers. It grounds itself not so much as the Catholics do. And the thing about the Catholics that fascinates me is the Catholics kind of sort of ground themselves on this like legal document, essentially, right? That like essentially like the emperor sort of gave to the pontiff like the dominion over Rome and all this stuff. But it turned out to be a complete forgery, right? Whereas the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't rely on this. The Russian Orthodox Church also doesn't rely on a pontiff. It has multiple patriarchs and a whole very, very dynamic ecumenical hierarchy in relation to like all the metropolitans and the patriarchs and all of that stuff. But it grounds itself on like this intense like ritual, this intense like asceticism, and this like the desert fathers and this kind of like removal against and away and from the world, right? And it is this kind of like that zine that was created by those American converts to Russian Orthodoxy, sort of Death to the World. It's this sort of like, and it typified. It comes from a quote from, I can't remember which church father it was, but one of the church fathers who basically was saying like, yes, the world means pleasure, worldly pleasures. The world means like these kind of Christian stuff, all the rest of it, But yeah, it's interesting, like. Orthodoxy kind of grounds itself much more in this kind of the contradiction between the Hebrew and the Hellenic traditions, right? In a way which Catholicism does not as much openly confront, right, or openly discuss. Whereas you see in Russian Orthodoxy, I don't know so much about Greek Orthodoxy, to be said. I don't know much about it, but I do know a little bit about Russian Orthodoxy in this regard. Like it grounds itself much more in this kind of contradiction and this strange relationship between the Hellenic and the Hebrew, right? And certainly I think sides more with the Hellenic in this regard, right? Is much more sort of like Platonic in its attitude towards faith. If my flatmate hears this, he's a proper Christian. He'll probably give me shit for this because it's probably some incorrect interpretation. But
no, everything I know, it's precise about Russian Orthodoxy. It is precisely that contradiction. It is the contradiction between maybe the Old Testament metaphysics, which I think Orthodoxy is still grounded within, and
totally, yeah,
and then Hellenism, which. Well, let me clarify what I mean by that. I think by the Old Testament metaphysics, I mean the kind of almost demiurgic, kind of almost Spinoza-like view of the immanence of material immanence, right? Does that kind of make sense, or?
Yeah, I mean, if you see, like, in sort of the interaction between like Abraham and God, right? Like all the conversations they have with each other, it's incredibly like, this is the thing, like, Christianity proper, like has this relationship of like like God is through Christ, right? Christ is the corporealization of God, and the corporealization of God. So you have like the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, and all that, right? But like Christ is like God made flesh or God made matter, right? God corporealized. But you have in the Old Testament some themes on the surface to repudiate that, in the fact that God speaks directly to Abraham. I'm not a fantastic biblical scholar. I can't give a very robust analysis.
It's intuitively speaking, Marx also talks about it. The connotation is basically that Judaism was more a religion of immanence, whereas Christianity is kind of a religion of transcendence. Marx writes that Christianity is the sublime thought of Judaism, and that's the way he put it into expression. But I think that the way orthodoxy relates to contradiction is basically that it dwells in this moment of contradiction in which, yes, we are still within the Old Testament world, but there is one moment of transcendence, which is a moment of contradiction, a type of hole or a gap in this material world of pure immanence. There's some type of hole, some type of gap within it, which is this moment of transcendence. Which is this moment of transcendence that resulting from the crucifixion, or I don't know, resulting from is such a horrible way to put it, but
Sure.
to me, the this is what I want to say. That's how this freezing within the moment of contradiction, the necessity of giving expression to the contradiction by dwelling within it, by freezing it in time. I think the orthodox idea of the katahon, is that how you say it? Katahon.
Yeah.
The thing that prevents the apocalypse. To me, apocalypse, the way I interpreted the orthodox apocalypse, is this kind of consequences for the old metaphysics that is opened up by the Christian transcendence actually being realized. Like, so to recap, basically, like, you begin with the metaphysics of the Old Testament, and then there's a moment of transcendence in Christianity. But the consequences this transcendence has for the metaphysical Old Testament world are not yet realized, and it must continually be postponed, and cannot be allowed to be realized, because this means the end of the world. And I think another way to you can then there's so many ways of actually interpreting that and looking at what that means. It also reminds me of it. To me, it's very Kantian in a sense. It reminds me of kind of the way in which the consequences of the Kantian transcendence, which is a more technical philosophical world, are not allowed to be realized metaphysically, or else the phrase Kantians use for this is metaphysical enthusiasm. If we go out and try to actually develop the thing in itself or the absolute object, we're engaging in a type of metaphysical enthusiasm. This is how Kantians reproach Hegelians, actually. And there's this weird affinity or proximity between Russian civilization and Kant. In the modern age, you can see this reflected in the neo-Kantian trends that Lenin was dealing with at his time, but also beyond that. And another thing I wanted to say finally was that another way of looking at the contrast, because you mentioned the significance of the patriarchs, the church fathers. I think the main significance of sophiology. Are you familiar with what this is? Sophiology?
I'm not so much, no.
Basically, a guy, his name is Vladimir I forgot his last name. He was a Russian theologian mystic who introduced a fourth, some type of fourth, I don't know what to call them, element to the Trinity, which is the feminine divine essence, the feminine divine, basically. But there was a fourth, right? And this is basically the beginning of what's called sophiology. Now, this same guy, actually, I'm going to look him up right now so I know his name. Hold on. So his name was Vladimir Solovyov. That's how you say it. Solovyov. He became a type of syncretic who tried to bridge Russian Orthodoxy with Western Catholicism, Western Eastern Christianity. But the reason why he introduced it. Okay, instead of laughing, just correct me, dude. Maybe it wasn't the Trinity. He was talking about something else.
I think from what I'm seeing now, I think you are right. In what he's saying. Yeah, you are correct. It is an introduction of a fourth instance in the Trinity. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just it's been. I'm kind of dusty on this. It's been a long time since.
It's really interesting. Yeah, I'm sort of skimming over it, but it is really interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
but you know what? Sorry to cut you off. Sorry, no. Actually, no. Continue.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Just really quick. The way I put it is that the reason why it makes sense that he was a syncretic is because he was actually making something that was always implicit in Russian Orthodoxy, this feminine essence, because femininity in the West, in the history of civilization, is associated with mystery, the unnameable, sacred, prohibited aspect of reality. He put that in explicit terms, and he translated something that was untranslatable. He made it intelligible from the Western perspective. But in reality, Russian Orthodoxy, also other Eastern religions, including Islam, they are always latent with this type of feminine divine. But it only works, like practically, it only functions in religious terms if you don't actually name it directly. If you name it and explicitly reference it, it becomes something else. Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you know what this has got me thinking is that, like, and this is definitely gonna I think this definitely be something quite interesting for you in sort of your critique of Anglo-Saxon, sort of what you call Anglo-Saxon, like modernity and all that, is if you look into like people like John Dee, right? Like who was like Queen Elizabeth's court alchemist, diviner, all the rest of it, right? And also the guy who, funnily enough, came up with the term British Empire. So that's a whole can of worms in itself, right? But like he was functioning off this idea that there is a hidden fourth in the three, right? A quadrinity in a ternary, right? And sort of he was working from this like Hermetic tradition, like he was kind of like a Protestant mystic, although someone in the chat will probably critique me for saying that, but whatever. I'm just trying to be simple. But like he's a Protestant mystic, but like he was pushing for this whole, like he thought he could communicate with angels, etc., etc. He was sort of in the kind of Landian thing. He was sort of communicating with the outside, right? Like he was kind of like communing with the outside and sort of informing himself based on this and kind of trying to like immanentize the end of the world, trying to immanentize the apocalypse essentially through this process of talking with angels. But like he was foundational, him and people like Francis Bacon and like William Shakespeare, etc., all these like fundamental people were very, very influential. Like he's just never talked about, right? But like not so much. But people like Bacon and Shakespeare who were in his circle, right? Like although I say William Shakespeare, people need to look up the work of a guy called Alexander Waugh so they can get red pilled on the who Shakespeare actually is. So I just put that out to people. Look up Alexander Waugh, get red pill on the Shakespeare question. But yeah, like people who are running in John Dee's circle were all sort of obsessed with this idea of a hidden fourth in the Trinity, right? But they were sort of functioning on this like Hermetic idea that the hidden fourth was man, right? The hidden fourth was man himself, right? And there is sort of a masculinity there, right? There's a kind of like there is a it's not just about men, but the humanity, but it's a masculine humanity, and it's not this kind of appeal to wisdom. It's kind of like the Hermetic like wisdom that is sort of the divine spark of mankind that is part of the hidden fourth in the Trinity, right? And I think you could probably, if you look into this, you could probably get a better critique than I can. Of the distinction between Eastern sort of like Eastern theology versus like Anglo-Saxon English theology. So I think that probably be quite a good rabbit hole for you more so than me. But yeah, that's all I want to say on that matter. I think it just reminded me of that because I think there's something quite interesting there.
The connection actually might be more relatable actually, because the Sophiologists, the way they would describe the meaning of the Sophia is that the Sophia is the body of humanity. Represents the body of humanity, yes. And Alexander Kojev was also very much influenced by Sophia. His work on the state, his specific work, I have it right here, the outline of the notes on the outline of the phenomenology of right. This was actually directly influenced by the Sophiology which takes into account the body of humanity, as opposed to the classical modern state, which is just this kind of the logos or the mind, right? But anyway, not to ramble in that direction, but to go back to the thing you were saying about Bacon and John Dee and stuff. You know what I find so tragical is that it is. I'm trying to think of the movie that this reminds me of, that explores this specific tragedy, but when we go back in time and we read about these people and actually read what they write, including people like Bacon, we come to realize that they tend to be almost very agreeable. Like you tend
Mm,
to read them and you think, wow, they're actually onto something, you know.
mm.
But yet, even I very often will be like, oh, the dogmatic Baconian metaphysics, and obviously I'm shitting on Anglo, dogmatism, and but when you actually go to the roots and the origin, you will find something very different than what the kind of the dogmatic consequences of it. That's what I think is what I mean why it's a tragedy. Like when you go back in time, the original thing was different than its actual consequences, if that makes sense. Um, the consequences in terms of like the way people filled in the blanks
Yeah.
in
Well, I
order
mean, you can
to
say the same thing with Marx, right? I mean,
exactly
like you
yes
can.
precisely.
It's like I feel like that's where you're leading with this, right? I mean, you can say the same thing with people like Marx, and sorry to the chat, but you can say the same thing with Lenin, and you can say the same thing with all these people, right?
Oh,
I
of
mean, it's
course,
like it's
yeah.
it's very unfortunate. I mean, something I was, sorry to sort of like kind of derail quite a bit back, but it's something I was thinking about in terms of the British Empire. Like, I don't know, it's something that I was like, as a kind of like prelude to the discussion we're going to have later on. I think that sort of like there's something very sort of strange that's like happened as a response to like sort of this like massive it's just thinking about John Dee and all that like and Bacon like thinking about like this kind of like the British Empire sort of does feel a little bit to me like it was kind of like resolving a lot of like England's kind of very, very strange internal contradictions with itself, right? I mean, like the kind of relationship that England has always had between like its Anglo-Saxons, Celts, and Normans, right? I mean, like there's a sort of three poles of like English civilization: the kind of the Germanic, Anglo-Saxon pole, the kind of Celtic pole, and the kind of like French. Also very Roman Normans, right? And how they imported it, right? I feel like something about like Brexit, right, as a moment, kind of feels to me because a lot of people kind of like sort of don't sort of understand what Brexit is. I think like Brexit, like to them, sort of feels like something which is like purely like this kind of irrational, stupid, proletarians being stupid, oh, they don't understand what their best interests are. They don't understand like what they need in this life. They don't understand like what is best for them. And it's like, it's not that they don't understand, what's best for them or what is necessary for them. It's that they know that what is told is the best for them is not what's the best for them. They understand that actually like to live properly, to live and exist properly, you have to have a little bit of risk involved, right? And to assert oneself as a collective body, and even if that collective body is not understood as a collective body as just yet, but it's becoming as such, right? I think in England and in Britain, we're kind of rediscovering a sense of like nationhood and a civilizational importance. I think what really comes apparent as time is going on is that the people who were the real successors to the British Empire, the real pro-imperial forces, are the Remainers, the people who voted Remain. Because, fundamentally, I think they're the people who sort of, they want a seat at the table, they want to be big, they want to be strong, they want to sort of like hold both the special relationship with, the Biden America and all that. Of course, they were skeptical about America when Trump was in office. Now that Trump's out of office, they're not skeptical about America at all, as to be expected, right? Like, but, they want to maintain their like relationship with the big powers, with America, with Germany, with France, with Europe, all this shit. They don't really want to they don't really want to sort of exist by themselves alone and actually interact with the world on a sort of equal footing with the rest of the world, right? They want to be a part of this big club, this big powerful club where they're alone, they're separated from the rest of the world and separated from like real countries, right? They want to be sort of better than that, and I feel like that's the real successor of like empire. I know this is a massive tangent and derailing, but it's just something that I feel like I needed to say.
I think it's relevant because empire can mean different things. British Empire obviously has a very specific connotation. But one thing I've noted before is this idea that sometimes empire seems like it's interchangeable with polarity. And the UK, of course, the crown, what the British crown represents is reactionary. But I like to say, big people's polarity, maybe is possible within the UK on the basis of equal relations between the constituent nations. But
Yes, I totally agree.
I'm 100% with you when it comes to your view and analysis of like 100% that this was exactly our analysis. The Remainers represented empire, and in the sense of
Yeah.
when I always use the word Anglo empire or whatever, the Remainers are precisely the epitome of that. Precisely.
100%. This is the thing. This is exactly why. And we're not going to get into it now, but this is exactly why we need to have our more long form discussion, where it's not like 4 a.m. and I'm not like drunk, you know.
Oh shit!
Like,
I'm so
I can
sorry.
pull my
Man.
notes up. No, don't worry about it, man. I mean, you know, I'm animated. You know, like this is a good conversation. But the only problem I have is I'm running out of cigarettes. But yeah, like this is something that we need to get into properly, because I feel like this is the thing about like what like. To me and to sort of some of the people that I'm talking with and sort of working with on like, you know, our own sort of political protests and things, is we see something in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, in Anglo-Saxon kind of, you know, principles of the Witenagemot and the Volksmutes and the system of like meeting places, the system of the hundreds, with elective monarchy, with the kind of Anglo-Saxon judicial system, with the relationship between Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. A lot is there which has been lost to time, which I think still has its remnants in the foundations of English civilization, that has been sort of like become like sort of, I don't know how to describe, like dormant code or like sort of sleeper code within it, which I think has been partially reawakened by the Brexit vote. And it's something which is, you know, I mean, this is another thing we have to talk about, especially is Jeremy Corbyn, right? Big problem with the left is Jeremy Corbyn, because the Americans, I mean, I remember like when,
agree.
you know, like people like Chapo Trap House or what, I mean, people, you know, groups like Chapo Trap House or whatever, they fucking love Jeremy Corbyn. And that's exactly the problem, right? With these people love Jeremy Corbyn, and that is who loves Jeremy Corbyn.
You know,
right? It's like,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you know, you go on.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
rambling.
I was gonna say, one of the memes I have that I always say, but I don't actually say it often on stream. I say it like internally, is that the biggest problem of the American left and the British left is the other. Like, the biggest problem for British left is America. America's the number one problem. The Americans are shitting it up for the people in the UK. But also it's our elites. Both of our professional managerial elites are bad influence. Like, for example, you know that guy Nathan Robinson?
Yes, I do.
Like, he represents the worst of that as it's being influenced on America. But at the same time that both of our elites are the worst thing for both of us, we can also exert good influence based on a new type of insurgent. Like, to me, the ideal is the unity between what you think saw the primordial Anglo people, like the real, which is rooted in the people. It's not what I say on stream. Like, when I mean by Anglo, I mean like these elites, which you mean is something demotic. Nick Land likes that term. You know, the word demotic is like, the root word is demos, so people, and demotic.
People, yeah.
And American demotic. These two can have a positive mutual relationship. But I 100% agree
that this is the real special relationship which should exist, right? The special relationship. I don't know if this word is so popular in America, this phrase special relationship, but it's something that's thrown around a lot over here to do with our cuckery to America, is they call it a special relationship. The real special relationship should be between, you know, as you say, the demos of the Anglo-Saxon people and the Celtic people with the American.
And, you know, specifically Brexit, I like to use that as an example, and to actually, because it's a way of thinking about the problems we have in America. So people would approach me and be like, well, that's kind of chauvinistic, because then that means you're against the Irish people and the Scottish people, and you're siding with English chauvinism. And then I said, listen, the status quo in the establishment is what sanctifies that chauvinism. When you return to the primordial roots, you can reset the relationship between these different national peoples on a new and fresh basis. And that's how I respond to people in America when they say, well, the populists in America are not really good on racial politics. And then I said, but the establishment here is what sanctifies racism. When you go back to the roots in the people, it's, yes, you're going to begin with all this prejudice and racism and chauvinism, but only then will you have the opportunity to reset the relationship, for example, between white and black America on a new basis, based on a new footing between equals. It's always the establishment that hypocritically sanctifies prejudice while at the same time pretending that it's the sole recourse against it. The British establishment, which was pro-Remainer, always pretended that it was the epitome of anti-racism, and that, oh, look at, we're London progressives and we're all we have no racism, we have no prejudice, it's all, multicultural diversity, but they are the structural and political incarnation of the reality of, for example, chauvinism that exists in the United Kingdom. Yes, many of the Remainers may be racist and chauvinist, but it's an open confrontation with that, based on a dialogue between revolutionary partisans and ideologists and the people. It's an open kind of way of confronting that. And by confronting, I don't mean like, canceling. I just mean like engaging with it, working with it, and somehow addressing
real
it that
discourse.
way. Yeah, a real discourse. Yeah, exactly. A real dialogue between the progressive forces and the people. That's the only hope there is, because the way, this is maybe going to sound super complicated and convoluted, but the way in which establishments and institutions interpolate the population incriminates those establishments for all of the racism and chauvinism and so on that may prevail among them. In other words, if you want to look at the cause, the real cause of racism and so on in the United Kingdom, you don't blame the people. You look at the institutions and establishment which has hegemony over interpolating them. Only a new basis for their interpolation will allow a platform for some new type of change to happen.
Completely. I think it's like, if you think about the people who if you think about, I used to be a part of a Marxist-Leninist organization which was both pro-Brexit and pro-Irish independence at the same time, right? Which is seen by establishment figures and pro-establishment figures who are absolutely not establishment but think they want to be. You deal with the same people in regards to Vaush or whatever, persons like Vaush, but we deal with the same people in terms of our left, right? Who sort of like say like, oh, how can you be pro-Brexit and at the same time pro-Irish unity, right? It's impossible to have that position, right? But it's not at all impossible to have that position. It's actually completely correct to have that position. It's completely, it's absolutely completely adequate to have that position, right? It's something which is like, it's been sort of stolen from us, the ability to sort of make clear that like Brexit is not an expansionist sort of like position of England sort of expanding itself over the whole country, right? It's a position of England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales being able to assert themselves as real entities that exist, as real things which exist outside of this universalizing, hegemonizing force of Europe. And I think this is the thing, like I think the next phase of the Brexit movement, right, which is not over. Brexit is not over. Brexit is not an event. Brexit was an event that caused a process to unfurl and revealed to people in this country the possibilities of political action in terms of asserting sovereignty, asserting autonomy, and asserting what is now nationalism, right? Now a kind of nationalism, but in the future will be more than a nationalism, will be above nationalism, something which is it takes the core of nationalism, the impulse, both the progressive and the reactionary impulses, which lend themselves and sort of are revealed by nationalism, and into something else. I mean, the way that Trump, right? The way that people always compare Trump to Brexit is actually completely correct in comparing them, right? In terms of like demagoguery, like people like Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, and Donald Trump all give like a reason and a sense, as you would say, a sense to people's actually existing impulses, actually existing resentments and passions and rages and feelings and intense, intense passions, right? It gives sense to them. But these demagogues do slip away in time, right? These demagogues are only representations of these things, right? They only give sense to these things in time. But these people do not manufacture in themselves these positions, right? Brexit was not manufactured by Nigel Farage. Brexit even itself is not like what Brexit really is. Like the word itself is incredibly problematic, right? It's Brexit, and Nigel Farage and all these figures and all these movements and events and things are indicative of a wider process of people rediscovering themselves in face of a rejection of universalism, in face of and it's exactly the same thing. And this is the thing that I'm trying to get through to people in my university, which is an incredibly like liberal, progressive, woke university. I'm trying to get across that, post-colonialism, decolonization, and Brexit are basically exactly the same position. It's exactly the same position. And this is the thing which, like, I think this is why fourth political theory and Dugin, sorry, to piss people off, right? But, Dugin is so important in this regard, is understanding that, like, no, to be effectively anti-racist is on a certain level to assert some kind of thing which looks like nationalism, right? Like the rejection of universalism requires some kind of ugly, or not requires, but comes about with an ugly face initially, right? It's a kind of ugly face which then becomes beautiful in time, Like it's something which, I'm rambling, but you see what I'm saying here, right?
No, 100%. Now, I do want to save a lot for our talk, but one thing I'll add to that is that one of the things that intrigued me about 2015 Corbyn, for all his faults, the original one, was this idea of reindustrialization and the revival of the UK's national economy. Because that's what
where the fuck did that go?
Yeah. That's what really stuck with me as something that leftists in the UK, I think, should have focused more on, was this fact that let's be basic Marxists. What in reality does the EU mean for the people of the United Kingdom? It means the reign of financial parasites and the complete repression and annihilation of the actual national industry and economy that is the lifeblood and, the economic foundation of British sovereignty, basic national sovereignty. And this was completely dropped and gone. And to me, that I feel like that is actually how we can analyze Brexit, not reduce Brexit in this vulgar Marxist way, but we can analyze Brexit as some type of longing for some type of return to having a real economic foundation, as opposed to what the EU means for the UK, turning the UK into a service economy. Now, what people, what people with any dignity would ever accept such a, degrading arrangement of all being rendered service workers, not having any, the history of this long. I don't want to ramble too far about the land pill, not the Nick Land pill, but the actual land reform pill. In the UK specifically, there's such a deep and primordial significance of land in relation to politics. You go back to the land enclosures, which was the origin of proletarianization. And then I'm sure you have a lot more to say about even further back, with the Norman conquest and before the Norman conquest. No people can exist without land. And the EU meant a new type of fundamental landlessness. And after and in the midst of the British people's deindustrialization.
Yes, completely. And I think something that the British left needs to confront in themselves is their fidelity to the Labour Party, and especially the sort of the kind of the myth of old Labour. the myth of people like, and this is going to be very contentious for any people who are British listening to this who are leftists. Sorry about this, but actually, Marxist-Leninists are usually good on this, right? They understand why old Labour is bad, but people like Nye Bevan and Clement Attlee, right? Especially Clement Attlee, like. Clement Attlee was the beginning of I sort of try to think of it like sort of like, the five heads of Marxism-Leninism, right? The kind of like the three heads of like English, like the kind of transformation of England and Britain in general. So I am a bit of an English chauvinist in my language, but I am what I am. But the sort of the three heads is Clement Attlee, Margaret Thatcher, and Tony Blair. They are one continuity. They're very clearly one continuity, because what happened under Clement Attlee with the sort of development, the war and the kind of the massive shock of the war, the trauma of the war, plus the sort of massive explosion of productive capability and information technology that happened because of the war. You had this ability to sort of, the slogan was, we've won the war, now let's win the peace, right? And what that meant was, let's apply what we have learned during the war to society. Let's mechanize in a way which is actually information based, right? It's like let's mechanize. And it's kind of like cybernetics, basically, right? It's like let's organize society according to this this nationalization is kind of like a logic of organizing society based on merit, organizing society based on like efficiency, and what that led to with the massive production of the construction of like council flats and great for people who are living there, right? For people who lived through horror and needed somewhere to live and needed life and needed fantastic in that regard, right? But you can't help but sort of notice, if you look into it for a little bit, that there is a direct continuity between that development and what later happened with Thatcher's financialization, and then later on with Tony Blair's managerialization, right? Like there is a direct continuity there. The groundwork was, and I don't like to think too teleologically, but I think this is quite correct. I do think, this construction of the nationalized economy, the nationalized state, state-owned industry in this way, in this capitalist, Keynesian way, did lend itself very much to Thatcher's financial revolution that took place, and I think the British left really has to contend with this, right, in their own history, because they're so wedded to Clement Attlee. They're so wedded to the institution of the National Health Service, the institution of the welfare state, so much as it is nowadays. But the welfare state, as this is the thing, people don't realize that most council flat buildings were meant as temporary tenements, right? And not most, but a lot of them were meant as temporary tenements. There's a place called Excalibur Estate, which still exists to this day, which is temporary, housing units, very basically prefab units, which were meant to be torn down within years of their construction, and they exist to this day, right? It's these things were meant to be temporary, and they were meant to be temporary because, as we see through history, as what is revealed in time, is that these things would be replaced by the privatization, right? The nationalization led directly to privatization. It's a one-to-one, right? It'd be straight into it. And I think it's something that the British left has not been able to really. There's someone interesting, I think, that you'd be interested in. There's a sort of movement within the Labour Party which is kind of interesting. They're kind of like small c conservative, social conservative socialists. The Blue Labour movement, people like Maurice Glassman. You know about that, yeah?
Yeah, I've heard of Blue Labour, yeah.
Yeah. I would recommend looking into Maurice Glassman. A lot of the stuff written about him, especially on his the Wikipedia page for Blue Labour, is full of bullshit. And a lot of the faith, family, and flag, that's never been a slogan of Blue Labour. It's just a complete construction by the media. But his Maurice Glassman's whole assertion is basically that we need to sort of he's very much kind of this soft social democratic version of Dugin, I guess. It's he wants to reject the progressive teleology. He wants to reject this idea of progress for the sake of progress, right? And he wants to understanding a deepening of the relations between people. But I think he's very good in terms of analyzing the problems that were caused by the Labour Party in regards to transforming itself out of its own tradition and into something which is wholly suited for financialization, and then later on Tony Blair's management economy, information knowledge economy. That's something the British left has not been able to deal with, and Corbyn was not able to deal with that at all, because he was caught between these two poles, right? Of reopening the pits, reopening the mines, renationalizing the economy, which was then drowned out in this leftization, whatever the fuck you'd call it, this aestheticization of leftist aestheticization of managerialism, and this kind of fidelity to the professional class.
caught between these poles, and the left in this country cannot push beyond that, right? It cannot seem to push beyond these two poles of managerialism and nationalization. But there is so much more that we are capable of in this country, right? Our history stretches back way before World War II. Like we have a rich history in this country. The labor movement has a rich history, and the fact that we sort of define it as something which happened after Clement Attlee, Prime Minister, Labour Party government initiated the welfare state. It's such a cucked mindset. And it really, it pisses me off. I almost definitely did not, respond to your point, and I just went on a ramble.
No,
but yeah,
I'm so glad. I know there's a lot we have to save, but there's a few things. The first thing is that, dude, you literally are on the money about why we have problems in America with the fucking Green New Deal bullshit. Like, they treat
I do not trust that shit.
New Deal the New Deal's the same, dude. It's like there's a direct continuity between the New Deal and Reagan and then Bush and Clinton, I mean, because Clinton was kind of our Blair. But to add more to your point, you're veering into territory that I'm too scared to present to my audience sometimes, because I presented it in the beginning in our streams. But basically my crazy idea was that if by socialism we mean, some type of total politicization of the economy, more or less, we're living in socialism already. And actually, neoliberalism in the West is the most advanced and sophisticated form. It's more socialist even than the New Deal and the British nationalization you're talking about. It's even more state politicization of the economy than before.
Yes.
Even a lot of people who support me were like, dude, you're a fucking idiot. And I just be like, okay, you're not ready then. You're not ready to learn about why this is the case. But you are so 100% on the money about that. And and there's a few things we have to note here is that one thing is that the word privatization is always so misleading, because what privatization basically means is that first the state establishes some type of control over the economy, and then it then selectively chooses what it opens up to quote unquote the private. Like if the state is able to privatize something, that in itself attests to a profound level of already socialized economy. And and my whole pill was basically that Marx and Engels were anticipating this total politicization of the economy in the form of their anticipation of the inevitability of socialism. And actually the thing that distinguished Marx and Engels with their dialectic view, specifically their materialist dialectic view and scientific socialism, was basically, for them, scientific socialism wasn't a total utilitarianization of the economy and people. It was a way to recognize that there's a contradiction in this universalization, and it's precisely this contradiction that gives meaning to the social in socialism. Our common sociality is not total politicization. It's something that resists total political control. The epitome of quote-unquote socialism, as we put it in modern-day sense, was Hegel's philosophy of right. And Marx was precisely critiquing Hegel because for Marx, Hegel's whole politicization of society neglected that there's a fundamental material substance or maybe even essence of humanity and society which resists this and which cannot be reducible to the terms of formalization and politicization. So, and there's another thing of note is that there's something very specific about World War II here that's a common thread. And it's also why people like you and me are always going to be accused of being fascist or right-wing adjacent.
Yeah.
It's like, it seems like the only thing the left can have today, it somehow it needs to return to the primordial origins of what was constructed in the aftermath of World War II. Not to return to World War II, not to return to the New Deal, but return to the origins of those things. And to me, I place that timeline roughly in the early 20th century and late 19th century with the populists. And to me, the left, the way I look at it is that we're witnessing an implosion of the post-World War II managerial state. And this implosion is unleashing all of the latent forces that composed it in the first place. Like, you had an evolution in America from the populists and the Southern Democrats and all these people into the modern Democratic Party. So the implosion of the Democratic Party also means the unleashing of these same forces that made it up. So
yes, we see the same thing in England. We see that in Britain. We see the same thing over here as well, in terms of the fact that, it's something, again, going back to Glassman and Blue Labour, something he always points out, which I think is completely correct, is that the origins of the Labour Party, in the Labour movement, the cooperative movement, the Labour Party, it comes from, in fact, not from kind of what people would consider as sort of abstract idea of worker organization, but the concrete reality of institutions like burial societies, right? Because in this country, I don't know how it is in America, but in this country, what used to happen to poor people is they would be chucked in massive pits called paupers' graves, right? Where they had wooden gravestones or no gravestones at all, and there would be no real commemoration of them. And what the sort of germ, the original initial sort of embryonic form of the Labour Party and the Labour movement in this country was one significant part of it was the burial societies, which actually gave meaning to people's lives and meant that in death they could still have meaning, right? And this is something which has been completely lost in the, because now we have, obviously everyone has a fucking, everyone is either burnt or, cremated, or they are buried and there is a gravestone. That's just a given. But that was something that was struggled for, right? And people missed that the struggle of the workers is not principally just only this kind of level of power in the total political sense, but it's also a power over meaning of life, right? It's a power over your ability to have meaning in your own life, and a big part of that is your meaning in death, how you're remembered in death, and that is something which the Labour movement, in its embryonic form, struggled for, was burial. Having the ability to be buried and have a gravestone. And that was something which the embryonic form of the Labour movement, the Labour Party, struggled for. And that's what started it. This level of camaraderie around death, right? This is another reason, there's a reason Blue Labour calls itself Blue Labour. It's not just because it's a joke on people say red Democrat in America or whatever, Vaush says retarded shit like that, or blue Republican, all this retard shit, It's this Blue Labour is a joke on that, but it's also a joke on also the mental health crisis. It's okay to be sad sometimes. Yes, that's true. It is okay to be sad sometimes, but it's also about the melancholia of existence, right? Existence is suffering. Life is suffering, and to give meaning to that suffering is one of the most important things that what a person can do, right? Alleviation of suffering is very important, but meaning to suffering is the only way which you can lead to an alleviation of that suffering, right? And this is something that's been lost. So many things have been lost. But yeah, it's something which, this is before World War II. This is before managerialization. This is before nationalization. This is before financialization, right? This is before the kinds of modes of struggle which are defined by, I don't know what you want to call it, high modern, whatever you want to call the post-World War II era. It's something which we are so caught in and struggling within the sort of the axioms of post-World War II political developments and World War II political developments. You see all these people talking about Strasserites and Nazbols or whatever. They have no clue what these words mean. These words have absolutely no relevance to the contemporary situation. Nazbols are, an eclectic. I mean, when you think about what Limonov actually believed, Limonov believed nothing. Limonov was a nihilist, Limonov was disgusted by the world, I respect him as an artist, as a creative. I sort of, I like to make art myself, so I respect him as an artist and a political artist, right? But the only person who gave meaning to the National Bolsheviks was Dugin, and he fucking left the party a long time ago, and it's people sort of use the word Nazbol as a way to say in that video where you're I don't watch Vaush except for through you, because I don't want to fucking watch Vaush, I only watch your critiques of Vaush because I need that fucking director's commentary shit. I need that fucking commentary on him, otherwise I can't fucking stomach it. But he's just disgusting, But the way he sort of talks about what was it, like the Nazbol vortex idea, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, they'll come and they'll say to you like, oh, you can have workers' rights, but you need to get rid of trans people and whatever, and embrace the family. It's like, well, the Nazbols actually rejected the family, right? The original, where Limonov actually, one of the major moments in the National Bolshevik Party after he left prison and all that, was, no, we need to create a Russia which is against the family, and he was a pederast as well, right? He's more similar to Vaush than Vaush would think, right? Vaush is more of a Nazbol than he fucking would like to admit. He's a fucking pedophile. So there you go. It's Strasserite as well. It's a meaningless label. It's a meaningless term. Strasserite is very specific to an internal dispute within the Nazi party that has no relevance to anything today. It's the same way that you want to think about the Nazbols. Oh, are they left? Are they right? That means nothing, right? When the Nazbols came about, the left and the right was monopolized by the CP, the Communist Party. What was meant by left and right was internal division between the Communist Party. There was no left and right outside of that. There was the punks and the dissidents and the sort of rebels and the nationalists. They were not defined necessarily by the left-right that was in state power, right? It's just, it's a very bizarre thing that people sort of use these labels and use these terms. And I'm accused of being a Nazbol. I'm on this same list that you're on, right? This closeted Nazbol list, right? I'm on this list of people on Twitter that are the badniks, right? The evil. It's very funny that people sort of use these terms without realizing what they mean, this is something we should talk about more in greater depth, I think, later on.
Oh yeah, I think it all goes back to this just anyone who's outside of the managerial state is somehow related to Nazism, because the managerial state defined itself in the aftermath of World War II. But one of the things they're missing is also the
But they took on Nazism, they took on Nazism.
Exactly.
The managerial state in America and Britain took on and basically made Nazism more efficient, They were real Nazis.
Yeah, I don't want to keep you up because, I understand. But one thing I wanted to say is that the thing you mentioned about blue labor and the significance of death, it's very Heideggerian. Heidegger specifically writes and gives significance to the way in which life is proven or somehow given meaning in terms of our relationship to death, our finitude. So I'm very interested in you've really sparked my curiosity in blue labor, and I really like what you mentioned about the significance of blue. There's also a kind of blue tone, I guess, to the channel that I want to have. In that same way, that it's just if blue means this kind of depth of this kind of fact of our finitude and how we deal with that and how we can, I don't want to say cope, but how we can basically confront that reality and acknowledge and just accept and almost, I don't want to be too Islamic, but surrender before it, right? Surrender before this. Stop trying to conquer this aspect of life. If this makes me a conservative of some kind, well, I guess I am a conservative. To me, there's different meanings of conservative. Conservative can mean trying to denounce reality in some way. And then in that sense, I'm not a conservative. I'm not a conservative who's trying to, create a standard of purity upon which to impose upon reality. But if conservative means the rejection of vanity and the rejection of this attempt to kind of conquer our reality and impose, some type of total rationalization or total so-called progress, quote unquote. Yes, I am a conservative. I think there's then again, it's the same thing as saying one is a Heideggerian.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're talking about here the distinction between, talking again about the sort of the interwar years, right? Relating this back to World War II, like the sort of the development of, you know, where Heidegger came from, that conservative revolution school, right? Like people like Schmidt and you know, most interestingly, people like Ernst Jünger as well. You know, fascinating person in terms of this. You know, someone that, like, you know, of course, like if you sort of think about, like, you know, like Schmidt is the political, Jünger is the artistic, and Heidegger is the philosophical, right? I mean, they sort of typify like a very, very interesting. It's something that I think, you know, really was amiss in England, right? That, you know, that we didn't have a conservative revolution, because I think we were definitely ready for one, and in terms of like the development of schools of thought. You know, like this is not, you know, to people who are going to clip this out of context, like I'm not saying that I completely agree with everything the conservative revolution or people like Carl Schmitt said. Just to make that clear, I just think that it's, you know, these sort of the people who like dealt with the trauma of World War One. And came out of that with trying to make sense of it in a way which wasn't just like, as they saw it, this vulgar reactionary politics and philosophy, which was just like, you know, like Dugin in the fourth political theory sort of talks about like it in the analogy of a dying man, right? He talks about like a man with a cough, you know, like a man has a cough, and like progressive people want to sort of like say like, oh well, the cough is actually good, you know, the cough is something which is, we like the cough, you know, the cough is all right. But then the reactionary is like, oh, we want to treat the person's cough, we want to treat the symptoms, you know, we want to get rid of the symptoms, the appearance of the cough needs to be done away with. But like the thing that's important about the conservative revolution is that they sort of, you know, as Dugin like says, you know, like again, this is going to be great for people who don't like me to clip out of context, but anyway, like, you know, the thing that Dugin says is like the conservative revolution wanted to just go back to exactly what started the cough in the first place and question that, you know, deal with the not with the symptoms, but the cause, deal with the cause itself. And this is something which comes out of great trauma. You know, you want to compare that to the National Bolsheviks and to that, you know, the trauma of the 90s, the trauma of perestroika, the trauma of the Soviet Union's collapse, you know, and you want to talk about what's happening right now with the Brexit movement, the trauma of deindustrialization. You know, it's an intense moment, an intense thing, intense process rather, which leads to a lot of traumatic response, right? And to make sense of that trauma, and not for this sense making to be endlessly foreclosed by these useless right-wing demagogues. And you know, like Hitler to the conservative revolution was this, you know, right-wing demagogue who essentially just foreclosed on any possibility of real fundamental change and real, you know, the communists also didn't engage with the conservative revolution in a fundamental way. You know, they kind of had little, like Radek had his policy of National Bolshevism, which Lenin said, no, that's fucking stupid, don't do that. And so you had, you know, whatever that was pushed to the side. But yeah, you know, like we don't have the ability at the moment to sort of, because you know, all these things have become so like we have these like psychic triggers in our brain which stop us from engaging in things. We don't have the ability to have a conservative revolution, I think. I mean, we do have the ability, but it's endlessly foreclosed upon the ability to have it, because we're sort of pushed against it by these phrases, these terms which are meant to turn us off, turn us against. We're meant to be endlessly progressive, or we're meant to be the bad alt-right, you know, like those are the two things we're sort of allowed to be. And I think we should be allowed to be much more than that, you know, in the way we think. I think we should be allowed to sort of, and we are allowed, you know, fundamentally, we're human beings, we have free will, you know, we're endowed with that fundamental thing of free will. We are meant to be able to think beyond these bizarre fucking axioms, right? These bizarre fucking psychic triggers that have been encoded within us to sort of make us like flinch. Or like love, or not really love, but sort of orgasmically react to fucking certain triggers and sounds and words and colors. You know, I mean, the science of advertising is a big part of this, but like, yeah, I think today is necessarily we need something which is kind of akin to the conservative revolution, but also akin to the Bolshevik revolution, right? Like we need new forms of response to trauma and response to the decay and the death of a world which is gone, right? I mean, you know, go back to Gramsci's whole interregnum thing, right? Like make sense of the monsters, right?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. You know, the thing a lot of people miss about the conservative revolution is that the way you just described it, it's perfectly a perfect description of how you can understand Marx's adjacency to this kind of conservative revolution. I mean, you can say that exactly the same thing about Marx. Marx also has a similar relationship to modernity. If I don't want to keep like name dropping people, but specifically Zizek's writings on Deleuze's repetition. I think what we're talking about here is repetition. To repeat something, to truly repeat something, doesn't just mean to do the same thing as what was the past, but to really confront this origin as you described it. So to repeat the moment in which the sick man gets the disease isn't simply, just repeating the exact same past, but it's a type of new confrontation with it. So I completely agree with you about this kind of significance of repetition. And then another thing, I think that there was an indirect adjacency between the Bolshevik Revolution on the one hand and the subjective revolution, the conservative revolution in Germany. But the reason they couldn't be united is because on the one hand, the Bolsheviks were defending the objectivity of their revolution. And they saw the German conservative revolution as not adequately recognizing that objectivity. On the other hand, the conservative revolution thinkers in Germany viewed the Bolshevik revolution too subjectively. They just reduced it to a type of subjective doctrine. And actually, interestingly, Heidegger and the rest of them, to the extent that they recognized any significance of communism, they just would read Lukács. Lukács specifically. So you have this type of contradiction going on where the subjective element was being monopolized by people like Lukács and others, who I don't think... I said this got me in trouble when I said this. I said Lukács was a Western social democrat, and he was never someone who appreciated...
Oh, I remember this, yeah. People made fun of you because you said Lukács was a Kantian. I mean, how the fuck can you, how can you disagree with that?
Yeah, I mean...
It's very strange.
Sometimes I say things and I'm not always aware, people are going to take it literally. Obviously, Lukács supported the Bolshevik Revolution. He rejected the politics of Western social democracy. All I meant was that he was secretly, he was implicitly, he still had prejudices from social democracy that he didn't discard. But anyway, going back, I think I completely agree with you today that we need a new type of engagement with this thinking. And also to apply it and repeat it again today. And I think this assumption that Marxism is irreconcilable, or even Marxism-Leninism is irreconcilable with that, is an unjustifiable assumption. I think people, they just don't distinguish the objective aspect of Marxism-Leninism from the subjective form. And the way we make sense subjectively of Marxism-Leninism, we have the whole, what Lenin would call the whole treasure of mankind at our disposal. We can't limit it to a narrow range of, halal literature. We have to engage with everything,
Yes.
But that doesn't mean we somehow become so arrogant so as to confuse that for the objective significance and way in which Marxism-Leninism cements and coheres definite, real and objective historical continuities and formations and reality, specifically in the form of states.
Yeah, completely. I think that's a perfect note to end on this conversation. But it's been a really fantastic discussion.
You've really opened my eyes to the fact that I think this will be the 7th episode of Infrared, but when we have our official show with you, I'm really looking forward to it because
so am I. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. I just didn't want to sort of impose myself, I just wanted to I was really enjoying watching how you were engaging with these fucking weirdos, these internet weirdos, and I was enjoying that a lot. I didn't want to derail your train, right? But I'm very glad I tuned into today's stream though, because when I tuned in, you were ranting about this shit, and it was you were ranting about the the sort of the limits of this kind of this attack, this debate bro kind of tactic, right? And it's like, yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic entertainment, right? It's fantastic entertainment, and it's good in terms of like building an audience base, right? But I think you're right in terms of like there needs to be a sort of more dynamic, like a more how do you say, like more stuff going on, right? You know what I mean? Like I think, I think
I mean, I completely appreciate it, man, and I think you really spoiled us with some really good content tonight, because I
hope
did
I wasn't
not
too
expect.
pseudy, right? Like, because I do come across as a pseudo all the time, and
No,
I hope
dude. From my perspective, at least, you are a very concise and clear speaker. I mean, I never thought you were ever rambling. I never thought you were veering into, an unintelligible direction. But to be fair, a lot of people regard me as like the epitome of somebody who rambles and makes no sense at all. So maybe it's not so much a compliment if it's coming from me, but it's the
just
best
kind
I
of
can
one
do,
of us kind of moment, right? Yeah.
I'm sure people in the chat would agree, though, that you're a very clear and concise thinker. I don't think anyone can. I can't see how anyone could say you're not making any sense.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation, and also it's a testament to how much I can drink and still maintain a clear train of thought. So,
Oh Jesus! Oh wow! Yeah, that's even more impressive. Like I
I'm not
struggle
trying
to
suck my own dick over here. It's more of a detriment than a quality. Being an alcoholic or whatever.
No, I struggle to speak that well when I'm sober. So that's really that's really cheap. Well, it was definitely a pleasure, man. It was really a pleasure, and
thank you.
yeah. Do you want all of these weirdos in chat to follow you on Twitter, or it's up to you?
If you want, be ready to be disappointed. Most of the time, I just post images and like jokes, But like, I guess Urban Maoism. If you want to follow me,
Let me get the link. All right. I'm gonna spam the link in chat. Yeah, our Twitter got banned, unfortunately, but
I know. It's like, I mean, but this is the thing. I think this is probably quite a good thing for you, though, right? Because like you've seen that, like these fucking dickheads, like they, these like weird neocon cult, like this like Kevin, whatever the fuck his name is. Like these people are meaningless, and like this, and we all know this in the audience, right? Like we understand these people are absolutely fucking meaningless, like, and like the content can be good, and we don't have to engage in, and it is we are all one thing here, the content is good, and it doesn't have to sort of veer off into sort of engaging with these stupid little cults, these stupid little neocon, absolutely meaningless little cults that can like surprisingly get people actually have an effect, it's amazing. Like the internet is so bizarre in this regard that these meaningless motherfuckers can have an effect. But yeah, it's quite a good moment, I think, for infrared as shit, to show that like, yeah, we as a fucking, like chat and as a thing don't have to fucking engage with these motherfuckers,
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, I definitely look forward to I'll try to get better with the scheduling. This week I have some bullshit due Wednesday, but maybe we can figure something out for after that, because from Wednesday to Sunday I think I should be completely cleared out, so I'll get back to you.
All right.
And if you want to the way to contact me now, because the Twitter's gone, is just on Discord, so just DM me on Discord and I'll be able to see it. But I'll be in touch, man, and hopefully we can plan this thing out.
All right, well, you have a pleasant evening.
You too. Thank you so much.
All right, man. See you later.
See you.